Hello, and welcome to my channel, Reading Little Blue Books Out Loud. This is a Little Blue Book. It happens to be Little Blue Book number 765, and it is titled The Life of Francis of Assisi, written by Henry C. Vedder, copyright 1925. This is part 3, and we left off at the beginning of chapter 3. Chapter 3 begins on page 30, and it is titled The Pope and the Friar. Greek tragedy loved to present some heroic soul like Prometheus, struggling against a fate too strong for him, with soul undaunted, whose head was bloody but unbowed. Such is the story of Francis from now on. His life began essentially anti-monastic, but he was gradually forced to assent to the formation of a new order of monks. He was a layman. His associates were laymen, and such they desired to remain, but they were forced to take holy orders as a condition of tolerance, and through Francis himself steadfastly refused any rank above that of deacon, his order became an order of priests, mainly through, not exclusively. He triumphed over his opponents only by accepting conditions that were worse than defeat. He was an apostle of liberty and love, expressing themselves in poverty and service. Circumstances forced him into the role of an ecclesiast and dogmatist. Never was a great purpose more completely frustrated. Never was a great life seemingly lived more nearly in vain. To see his ideals perverted, to see his rule of poverty violated, even while hypocritically professed, to see religion made a cloak of idleness and vice, to see all he praised for great success, while he was conscious of entire failure. That was the tragedy of Francis. The essential elements of this man's character and the nature of his work, especially in the earlier years of it, are better told in the legends than in the authentic history. The history mostly yields us a few dirty facts. The legends clothe them with flesh and blood and make them live. There is often a truth superior to the truth of fact, and in the little flowers of St. Francis, those incomparable stories of the words and acts of the saint, we have this. Free use is here made of these and other legends because they give us much truth about Francis without being literally true. The stories told of his works of charity, ministration to the bodily wants of others, his forgetfulness of self, his simple and unconscious devotion to the dear Lady Poverty, are very touching and doubtless true in the main. His confidence that his way of living was the right way, for him at least, and for those who shared his conviction, and his belief that many would embrace it, never wavered. Once, when his brothers were downcast, he related to them a vision he had seen. Be comforted, my beloved, rejoice in the Lord. Let not the smallness of your numbers sadden you, and be not alarmed at my simplicity or yours. God has revealed to me that he will increase you, and that you shall spread to the ends of the earth. I would fain be silent of what I have seen, but my love of you obliges me to disclose it. I have seen a great multitude coming towards us to make the same habit and to lead the same life. I have seen all the roads filled with men walking this way in a great haste. The French come, the Spaniards are hastening, the Germans and English are hurrying in. All the nations are stirred, and I have still in my ears the sound of those who come and go to perform the orders of holy obedience. We can see that the form of this saying has been colored by the later history of the order. What is essentially true in it is that Francis never thought of the possibility of failure. He was sure that God had called him to this life, and hence was as certain of success as he was of the existence of God. It is such faith that in all ages has cast out demons and removed mountains. From the time of his return from Rome, all obstacles seemed to melt away in a manner truly wonderful. Numerical success was immediate and almost overwhelming. Francis was rather embarrassed by the eagerness of men to enter the order, than by any reluctance to hear him or his message. All Italy seemed smitten with a sudden rage for poverty. Wherever Francis went, crowds flocked to hear him, and by scores and hundreds. They besought admission into his order. He sent out some of his most trusted disciples the following year, 2 by 2, and they had almost equal success with their leader. This would have been enough to turn the head of most men, but he was unmoved. Such popularity was to him a misfortune rather than a blessing, and he strove in vain to limit rather than increase the number of his adherents. For he recognized from the first that a life of genuine poverty and devotion would appeal only to a few choice souls, deeply convinced that in this way they could most effectively serve Christ and their followers. But the movement quickly got quite out of hand. Francis had started something larger than he realized, something too powerful to be stopped. At best, it could only be controlled and directed. So marvelous was the progress that at the General Assembly of the Order in 1219, 7 years after the Pope's qualified approval, 5,000 members attended what was like a modern camp meeting. They lodged in small booths on the plains about Assisi, and henceforth this meeting was known in Franciscan literature as the chapter of the Mats. Some have pronounced this number incredible, but it is too well authenticated to be dismissed in that airy manner. It is probable there was no greater exaggeration than usually happens when large bodies of people assemble and are estimated rather than counted. It was evident by this time in Rome that Francis was succeeding beyond all expectation, evident that formal papal approval of his work could not be much longer withheld, and evident also that more definite control of the movement must be acquired by the papacy, or it might become a serious danger to the Church. An enthusiast is always a menace to a great organization. He is erratic, there is no telling what he might do next, but he is less dangerous inside the organization than outside. Inside, his energy may be skillfully directed into safe channels, or he may be encrusted, so to speak, outside. He is capable of incalculable damage. It was necessary, from the papal point of view, that Francis and his order should be safely encrusted in the great Roman organization. The most influential friend whom Francis had made up to this time was Cardinal Uguglio, who in the world had been known as Count Hugo of Senghe. He had risen to first place among the cardinals, was chief adviser of Honorius III, who succeeded Innocent III in 1216, and was himself to become Pope Gregory IV in 1227. He became the chief protector and adviser of Francis, which meant chief director of the order, and under his skillful and almost unperceived guidance, its transformation began. It occurred to the cardinal that the best way to remove the Pope's distrust was to bring Francis before him. The Proverello was with some difficulty persuaded to go to Rome for this purpose. He presented himself elaborately to preach before the Pope, and committed his discourse to memory, but when he found himself in the presence, forgot every word. He did something much better, however. He spoke from his heart, with so much warmth and simplicity and sincerity that he won the entire assembly. The Pope was convinced of his piety and humility. Here was no heretic in intent, but here was a man whom it was difficult to control, to discipline into that abject obedience which was the Roman ideal. He was still a perplexing problem, for it was evident that he would always take a line of his own. What arguments Cardinal Ugolino, Ugolino, may have employed to overcome the objections of Francis to a more formal organization and a more definite rule, he can only conjecture. Saboteur, in his excellent biography of the saint, gives pages of conversation and explanation that certainly might have happened, but that is all we can say. Certain it is that Francis partly gave way. Beyond a definite point, he cannot persist without open disobedience and a break with the Church. But it is equally certain that from 1220 onward, all that was done to alter the character of the order was either done without his knowledge or against his protest. The first step in consummation of the papal plan was the issue of Honorius III of a brief dated September 22nd, 1220, in which a new regulation was made that quite imposed the ideals of the older monastic orders on Francis and his companions. In almost all religious families, it has been wisely established that those who desire to practice regular observances should make a trial of these observances during a determined space of time, and that they themselves should be on trial also. The intention of this is to prevent future regrets, by giving no opportunity for inconsiderate acts. Wherefore we command you by these presents henceforth to admit no brother to your order before he shall have made a year's probation, and for the same reason we will that when once this profession has been made, no brother shall be able to leave the order, and if anyone does leave it, we forbid every one to keep him with them. The publication of this brief marks the close of the heroic period of Francis and his order. His new wine had been forced into the old bodies of the monarchism. His great work was done. The rest of his life, only 6 years, was a slow martyrdom and increasing anguish of soul, as he saw his ideals thwarted, his society perverted. But looked at from the papal point of view, this was as deft a stroke of policy as Pope ever devised. All danger of schism or heresy had been averted by one dash of the pen. Nothing moves more one's admiration for the shrewdness of Rome, for its astute and far-sighted policy, than its manipulation of Francis and his society. When, in 1223, Honorius III issued the bull formally establishing the order of Francis, the triumph of this policy is seen to be complete. There is nothing left of the original society but the grey robe and the nominal roll of poverty. Every brother must dispose of all his goods on entering the order, and is prohibited from receiving coin or money, either directly or through an intervening person. We find it somewhat difficult to sympathize with the almost fanatical zeal of Francis against money. He seems to have seen in it the root of all evil, and came near excreting it. On this point, no rule could be too explicit for him. No renunciation could be too absolute. If the rule were relaxed at this point, he believed that soon nothing would be left. There would be no stopping point. He was probably right in this, as the subsequent history of the order clearly shows, and on the main question he was also right. If a little extreme, money was the easiest kind of property to gain. Those who had no other could get some of that, and love of property, zeal for wealth, was the great curse of his age, as it has been of every age. Avarice, greed, has been the besetting sin of mankind, and still is. Francis saw men not so much possessing wealth as possessed by it. The hope for the victory of love of neighbor over love of things. He was too sanguine, too optimistic, but we love him for it. Even before this, Francis had despaired of the future of the society, and formally laid down his authority as general of the order, or head of the society, as he might better be called. From henceforth, he said to the friars, I am dead to you. But here is Brother Pietro di Cantana, whom you and I will all obey. And prostrating himself before Brother Pietro, Francis promised him obedience and submission. There is great confusion in the Franciscan literature about this matter, for Francis is often represented after this as general and acting as such. Probably what really occurred was that he deputed part of his executive authority to others. In one sense, there could be no other head of the order while he lived, but he had singularly little capacity for organization and direction of large bodies of men, in this respect differing greatly from such leaders as Ignatius Loyola and John Wesley, each of whom in his own way showed supreme administrative skill. Francis was the soul of the movement, the great inspirer, and in that sense the leader. But the formal guidance must be supplied by others. The way in which the Spirit was to manifest itself, he had no skill in devising. In increasing weakness of body, but with soul undiminished in zeal, Francis continued to do his work of loving ministry to the poor and the sick until the end was visibly approaching. His last months were spent in meditation on Mount Alverna, in the upper valley of Arno. Here, in an ecstatic vision of the crucified Jesus, he is said to have received the stigmata, or the marks of the nails and spear that pierced his master. What purports to be the testimony of his closest comrades has come down to us, not perhaps in its original form. It represents the marks on the hands and feet, not as wounds, but as darkly calloused places. Only in the side was there an actual wound, from which sometimes oozed drops of blood. Until recently, this question has not been critically treated. The Protestant method has been to reject the whole story as manifestly false. Another of these spurious miracles that are profusely strewn through Catholic literature, and especially in the biographies of the saints. By Catholics, the story has been credulously received, and even enormously magnified, as undoubtedly true and undoubtedly miraculous. Miraculous it certainly is, in the sense of transcending ordinary experience, and to many seeming wholly inexplicable, except on the theory of direct divine intervention. But modern science knows nothing of miracles in the sense of a superstition or alteration of the laws of nature, with that which it believes to be unwavering. There is, however, an explanation of the stigmata that neither denies their reality nor accepts their supernatural origin, an explanation at once scientific and simple, and so entirely credible. The annals of medicine contain many cases, rarely happening, yet in the aggregate quite numerous, of extraordinary effects produced on the bodies of persons of delicate, highly sensitive nervous organization by intense and prolonged mental states. These cases are well authenticated and absolutely convincing. They remove from this experience of Francis every trace of the miraculous and leave it, like so much of his life, simply wonderful. The sole question is, do we have sufficient testimony as to the fact in this case? The testimony is very strong, if not quite conclusive. The stigmata may be regarded as merely the strangest of many evidence of the great intensity and fervor of the spiritual life of this unique man. Francis returned to the Portiuncula to die. Francis returned to the Portiuncula to die. This had been from the first a sort of headquarters for the society, and general gatherings or chapters had been held there. A cluster of rude booths had been erected by its side, and in one of these little cells the dying Poverello spent his last days. With little pain and no recognizable disease, he slowly faded out of life. On October 3rd of 1226, at nightfall, he breathed his last, and was buried the following day. 2 years later, his friend and protector, Cardinal Ugolino, now became Pope Gregory IV, came to Assisi and conducted the formal ceremonies of canonization, at the same time laying the cornerstone of the great cathedral beneath whose altar the saint's remains now rest. Later, the magnificent church of Saint Marie d'Assini was erected to enclose the little chapel of Portiuncula and the cell of Francis. The two structures, more incongruous with the entire life and spirit of the Poverello, the wit of man could never have devised. They are monuments, not of his success, but of his failure. And that is the end of chapter 3. And we'll stop there, and I will see you in chapter 4, part 4, for chapter 4. Thanks for listening.